everyone. It's lovely to see you here. Very welcome to our second day of the Integrity of Creation Conference. To open our remarks today, it's my pleasure to introduce the Provost of our university, Dr. David Dowsey.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Duquesne University. I'm really glad to be here to be able to welcome you to the second day of our Integrity of Creation Conference. And I'd like to make sure to thank the conference organizers, obviously Jerry McGill for his steadfast work over the years of helping with this conference, and many others who have been involved, in particular Glory Smith, who's faithfully served as our coordinator for this event, and we're grateful. As you know, this is an interdisciplinary conference focused on civil discourse around a particular theme. This year, the theme is Towards a Healthy Planet. After a welcome from President Gormley last night, I understand via video, so it was kind of like the Wizard of Oz, the man behind the curtain you got to see. We had a great presentation by Jim Gates, who is a professor at Brown University, and he spoke about the challenges, and let me make sure I get this right, anthropocenic policymaking. I always joke the first speaker at the Integrity of Creation Conference always has a big word somewhere in the title of their presentation. That's how you know you've really come to a good conference, when you have to say, what is that? We're going to continue our discussions today. We've got an excellent slate of speakers. We're really excited to welcome them. They're going to discuss everything from food security to climate colonialism to the changing norms, changing cultural norms to reduce the amount of food waste. These are all really pressing challenges and good things for us to be discussing at this important conference. The global and interdisciplinary nature of this conference highlights not only the size and scale of the problems we face to maintain a healthy planet in a modern era, but also the fact that we all need all hands on deck if we are to find a sustainable path forward for our children and grandchildren. We live in this very interconnected world, as you're all aware, where decisions made in mass consumption societies, and those are societies that place a disproportionate value on consumption and consumerism, I'm sure you're all aware that the United States is chief among them, have tremendous ripple effects on the rest of the global ecosystem. The most negative effects are often felt by those on the margins of society who have no voice or no decisions that are being made, to the decisions being made that obviously dramatically impact their lives. Duquesne University was founded by the Spirit and congregation who have a deep and profound reverence towards the natural world and its interdependent nature. Duquesne is dedicated to finding ways to reduce consumption of natural resources and promote sustainable living, especially individuals that need that most. This conference is one of the many ways that we do that, and it's an honor to be able to host it. We are grateful to all of you for your good work in this area and look forward to working together for a sustainable future. Thank you.
And just before we have our faculty to introduce our speaker, I think we've got Catholic Central. You guys from Catholic Central? Central Catholic. I knew you'd trip me up in that. Okay, these are high school students who are joining our conference. Central Catholic, as you know, is a very prominent boys' school here in Pittsburgh. And their posters at the very back along the wall, this is their senior thesis posters. Is that kind of like the kind of thing, or some of them? So this is very cool that they've contributed these posters to our conference, so you're very welcome. You're going to be also meeting your year group from Ireland. There's a group of high school students from Ireland. Is Ronan here yet? They'll be coming later on this morning, and they'll be sitting at this table beside you. Now, you guys have come in just a couple of miles. I think Oakland's not far away from here, right? I'm just joking. So they've come from Ireland. They flew in from Ireland, so you'll get to meet your peer group working in the same kind of thing. So this is good. Let me now introduce Professor Jane Moriarty, who is the Associate Dean in the Law School, and Professor Moriarty will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to welcome all my evidence students who showed up to support. I'm so glad to see you all this morning. Good morning. I have the happy task of introducing Mary Jane Angelo, the Samuel T. Dell Professor of Law, the Director of the Environmental and Land Use Law Program, and an alumni research scholar at the University of Florida Levin College of Law. She is also an affiliate professor at the University of Florida School of Natural Resource and Water Institute. She has published extensively and shockingly published 2 books in 1 year in 2013, for which anyone deserves a medal if they can do that. So our hats are off to you. The work she writes about and teaches about includes pesticide law, endangered species law, water and wetlands law, sustainable agriculture, the regulation of genetically modified organisms, and the relationship between law and science, which is how I was able to locate Professor Angelo and read her work. In addition to publishing 2 books, she has published numerous articles and has published them in wonderful places like the Texas Law Review. She has also served not on 1, but on 2 National Academy of Science National Research Council Committee. The first, which she has served on for 8 years, I believe, is the Committee on Independent Scientific Review of Everglades Restoration Process. And I think the entire country is thankful for the work you do on that, as well as the Committee on Ecological Risk Assessment under FIFRA and the ESA. In addition to speaking throughout the United States and around the world, she has also been to places such as Brazil, Uruguay, Belize, and Poland. She was also a lawyer for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Office and the Office of General Counsel in Washington, D.C., among other places. She practiced as an environmental lawyer, working on topics related to water law, wetlands law, endangered species, and various other areas of environmental law. She received her BS with high honors in biological science from Rutgers University and both her MS in entomology, which I believe is bugs, not to be confused with etiology, which is the origin of words, and JD with honors from the University of Florida. We are enormously pleased to have her here today. We had invited her last year and she had a sad accident that prevented her from coming. We were so lucky to get her to come back this year. I hope you will join me in welcoming Professor Angelo to speak on food security, industrialized agriculture, and a changing global climate. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me with this? I tend to wander around, so I need the portable microphone. So thank you so much, Professor Moriarty, for that kind welcome and introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me back after I had to cancel at the last minute last year. 2 days before I was supposed to speak here, I just told Dr. McGill it was a accident where I broke 3 bones in my leg and dislocated my ankle and had to have 2 surgeries. It was actually an accident that occurred. Everyone assumed it was a car accident, but I was stand-up paddleboard surfing. So, true story. Last year the theme of the conference was water, so I was trying to get into the water spirit. And unfortunately, as they were rolling me into surgery, I said, I have to fly to Pittsburgh in 2 days, and the surgeon said, yeah, well, that's not happening. So I'm so happy you invited me back and that I can be part of this fabulous conference, which is off to such a great start with Dr. Gates' talk last night. So last Friday, in fact, we saw the climate strike where literally millions of young people throughout the entire world voiced their anger and concern about the urgency of climate change and what it means for their future. For those of us who have been working on climate change issues for many years, it's heartening to see so many young people, really speaking out about this issue, which is going to affect them dramatically. And I see these young people here, and to you I say, I'm sorry that we didn't do a better job and left a mess for you, but I'm happy to see young people like you engaged and hope that this will continue. I hope that this represents a sea change, so to speak, and hopefully the tipping point on public awareness on climate change will occur before the tipping point, what Dr. Gates called the tipping point monster of climate change. We've known about climate change for a long time, and the science has been around for a long time. The first science advisor to brief a president on climate change was President Lyndon B. Johnson in the 1960s. So it's nothing new, but our science is much more sophisticated, and so we have a much better understanding. Let's see if I can use this. And now we have real data. We can see the data on the increase of temperature, the increase of sea level rise, the increase of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And we know that most of that is due to man-made emission of greenhouse gases. And we know that the human influence on climate change is clear, and we're seeing these changes now. But we don't need to see the science to feel what's going on. Just currently, you know, in the last couple weeks, the Amazon burning at an unprecedented rate. People in Switzerland and Iceland holding funerals for glaciers that are gone, that have been there throughout human history. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. The devastation of these more frequent and more extreme hurricanes like Hurricane Dorian that just destroyed parts of the Bahamas. And this photograph is taken from not very far from where I live in Florida, where houses are literally falling into the ocean. I think that an unfortunate image of climate change in the past was that it was all about polar bears clinging to shrinking icebergs. And so it was easy for some people to dismiss it. Now, many of us care about all living things, and we do care about polar bears, but the message that got lost in this is that this is really about people. And the climate change crisis will be one of the greatest humanitarian crises of our times, or if not the greatest, if we don't act quickly to do something about it. People all over the world are already feeling the effects, and the most vulnerable populations, the poorest people in the world, are going to feel the effects the worst. We're going to see mass migration away from the coast, refugees, you know, at an unprecedented scale if this continues. And I think that my talk today focuses on food security and agriculture, and I think this is an area where it's no more evident how serious this problem is for people than in this area. We've already seen over time the trend historically of food prices going down. We're seeing the food prices go up. And after every time there's a shock to the system in terms of some kind of major climate event, food prices spike up. In 2007, 2008, the global economic crisis, as well as some extreme climate events, resulted in dramatic increases in food prices. And so that we know that a world food crisis is looming large if we don't do something about our greenhouse gas emissions. And this crisis not only will mean people don't have access to the food they need, but their health will be compromised, making them more vulnerable to other climate change impacts like heat and spread of disease. but it also will cause instability and conflict when people don't have the food that they need. The United Nations describes food security as where all people at all times have physical or economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. And this is what we're talking about here, is that currently more than 820 million people in the world are considered hungry. And that number is rising in almost all areas of Africa and many regions of Latin America and Asia. 2 billion people in the world experience moderate or severe food insecurity, so they don't have access to sufficient nutritious food, which puts them at risk of a number of things, including poorer health outcomes. And climate variability and extremes are exacerbating the rise in hunger and food insecurity. We currently have over 7 billion people in the world. That number is expected to rise to over 9 billion by 2050. And so we have this population growth, and at the same time, the increased affluence in certain parts of the world, like and particularly in China with large populations, is people are demanding different, more energy-intensive kinds of food, like meat. So it's anticipated that between the growing population coupled with the growing income, that we will need to increase food production by about 50% by 2050. So that's a pretty daunting task in and of itself, but when you find out that climate change is expected to decrease global food production by about 25% in that same time frame, now it becomes an even more dramatic, more challenging problem to address. How do we increase food production by 60% when our climate is decreasing food production by 25%? So we have a big task ahead of us. One of the reasons I like to talk about agriculture and climate change is because they are so closely linked. Agriculture is a significant contributor to climate change, particularly the way we do it in the developed world, the industrial agricultural model. But climate change will have dramatic impacts on agriculture. So they're inextricably linked, and the bad part of that is agriculture is part of the problem and will be seriously affected by climate change. But the good part is agriculture can also be part of the solution to the climate change problem. So just a little sort of review of what I mean by industrialized agriculture. Our current agricultural system in the U.S. and in many parts of the developed world operates on this zero-sum principle, where agriculture and functioning ecosystems are treated as mutually exclusive. Agriculture has become an industry. Our farms are monocultures that rely very heavily on fossil fuel inputs, and those are for our synthetic pesticides and our synthetic fertilizers, as well as the operation of various kinds of machinery. And so because we're putting so many fossil fuels in, we're getting byproducts, pollutants out, and many of those byproducts are greenhouse gases. So our current system contributes to a lot of different environmental harms, including greenhouse gas emissions with climate change. And I just would be remiss if I didn't mention that this isn't directly related to climate change, but our industrialized agricultural system really puts farm workers and their families and communities at great risk. Those are some of the highest risk jobs out there, particularly from pesticide exposure. So we've gotten to this place because as we all know, people have moved off the farms and into cities and suburban areas, and our total number of farms have declined dramatically, but the acreage of our farms has remained about the same. So what we have is fewer, larger farms. And The green revolution of the 1960s resulted in dramatic yield increases in our crops. So it was really, touted as this is going to solve the world's problems. This is going to solve hunger problems. And while we have those dramatic increases, it hasn't really solved those problems because there's issues with distribution and access to food that go beyond just producing food. But it also has had a lot of negative effects by replacing human labor with fossil fuels, the migration to urban and suburban areas, which has really caused the dying out of a lot of our rural communities. But we have increased yields dramatically, but it's been through the use of fossil fuels. So we no longer have this as our farming image, or the small family farm, but now our farms are mostly this. We no longer just have a few cows wandering around in a field, but our livestock is in these massive feeder lots, these concentrated animal feeding operations that produce huge amounts of pollutants, including methane, which, as Dr. Gates discussed last night, is one of the most potent greenhouse gases. The IPC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says it's about 34 times as potent a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. I think Dr. Gates said 80-something%. That may have to do with the time frame on which you measure it, but in any event, it's much more potent. And we just have different expectations about what we expect from our food, and so everything's very manipulated, even square watermelons. Like, how do we live without square watermelons? I don't know. And so as a result, every calorie of food that we consume, a lot of calories of petroleum have gone into making that food. And it's a very inefficient process. It takes a gallon of gasoline to produce a bushel of corn in this country. So largely because of these fossil fuel inputs from pesticides and fertilizers, which, if you don't know, they are actually made from fossil fuels, from oil and from natural gas. So those are very large contributors, and we're just putting them into the environment in very large quantities. But also farm machinery and the energy used for transportation, processing, and distribution. So greenhouse gas emissions also from animal wastes, and the methane from animals is a very serious problem. I'll talk more about in a minute. But also land clearing for agriculture, because the carbon that was sequestered in forests or grasslands being converted into agriculture, releases a lot of carbon from the plant material and the soils. This is, I think, is interesting. It's a breakdown of where most of the emissions come from. And as you can see, if I'm reading this right, yeah. So red meat and dairy combined make up about 48% of our agricultural greenhouse gases, or our food greenhouse gases, I should say. And if you look at, we hear about the locavore movement, people wanting to buy local foods that haven't traveled a lot of miles and relied on fossil fuels for transportation, and that certainly is an issue. But if you look at, I'm doing this wrong, where these fossil fuels are mostly coming from, it's the production phase of agriculture. So if we want to address, agriculture's climate change contribution, we certainly need to deal with the production. One of the problems with our current industrialized agricultural system is that it lacks diversity. We have these huge monocultures, and therefore it lacks resilience. So when you have a huge monoculture like this, any kind of impact is going to cause problems on a larger scale than if you had redundancies built into the system through diversity. And the classic example of this was the Irish potato famine, where widespread famine and starvation, hunger in Ireland because potatoes were a staple crop that people relied on, but they were really only growing one variety of potato. And so when this particular disease hit Ireland, because they were only growing one variety and it was susceptible, most of the potatoes got this blight and died out. Whereas if you had a more diverse, different varieties of potatoes, some of them would not be susceptible to the disease and would survive. And that's what we saw in Peru, where there are over 200 varieties of potatoes. And so the varieties that are affected by the blight were only a small portion of the overall, so there was plenty of potato varieties left for people in Peru. And so that's sort of the classic example of what happens when we don't include diversity on our farms, that the crops are much more susceptible to disease, to pest outbreaks, and to climate. If there's a drought and all the plants are the same and they're susceptible to drought, you're going to have more problems than if you have a variety, a diversity on the farm. Another aspect of this lack of diversity in our current industrialized agricultural system is the heavy reliance on synthetic chemical pesticides. And pesticides are interesting because in most areas of environmental law, we seek to reduce the amount of harmful substances we put into the environment, right? If we can find technology to reduce the emissions, or if we can find alternatives that aren't as toxic, that's what we try to do. With pesticides, we intentionally and unequivocally put vast amounts of chemicals into the environment for the purpose of killing things and disrupting things. That's what pesticides are. They're designed to kill pests. And so we end up in a situation that we're in now where we're on what I call the pesticide treadmill. So dramatic increases in the use of pesticides since World War II, from about 50 million pounds a year to more than 1 billion pounds a year. But at the same time, our crop damage from pests has increased. So you may ask, well, how could that be? And let me start by saying, I think we need pesticides in many circumstances. I just think we've overused them and we've created this treadmill effect that is very much like, well, I'll get to that in a minute, the resistance issue. But the first issue with overuse of pesticides is that, and this represents pest populations. So if pest populations grow and we treat the farm with pesticides, we see a dramatic drop in the pests population initially, but then we see a spike, or what we call a flare back. Does anybody know why we see that flare back? Yeah. So one issue, and I'll talk about that more in a minute, is that pests develop resistance to pesticides just like bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics we use. So that's certainly a big part of it. But there's another thing going on too, which is when we spray these pesticides into a field, they don't just kill the pests. They kill the predators and parasites of the pests that normally would keep the pest populations to some degree in check. So now there's no natural control of the pests, and the populations spike even higher than they were before. So then what do? We use more pesticides, and we end up in this vicious cycle, or this pesticide treadmill. And as this young man just pointed out, one of the issues here is with resistance. So if we look at a population of pests, there's always, just like Dr. Gates was talking about these distributions last night, and there's always going to be some portion of any population that's going to have more resistance to something than than the rest. So let's say this is the small part of the pest population that's resistant to the pesticide. If we apply the pesticide, now instead of having this distribution, all these resistant pests are going to make up the majority of the next generation. And so then we're going to have more resistant pests. And as generations go on and insects and other pests have short generation times, we're going to develop resistant populations just like we see with antibiotic resistance. So that's another reason why we end up using more and more pesticides. And we've seen, and this only goes up to 1990, it's even worse now, that we're seeing resistance develop to many pesticides in many parts of the United States and the world. Another aspect of industrialized agriculture is that the way we do animal production is very inefficient and wasteful. I find this very interesting. It shows the Earth's land mammals by weight. And it's hard to see maybe, but these are humans, that's us, and all of these in this light gray are our pets and our livestock. Wild animals are the green. So by weight, the vast, vast majority of animals on the planet are human or livestock, and very few, or very small proportion are our wild animals. Like if you look here, it's like, this is elephants, and they're big animals, right? So I'm going to talk about why our animal production is so inefficient and results in such greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm glad Dr. Gates isn't here because I'm talking about physics, and I probably don't have it quite right. But Sir Isaac Newton's second law of thermodynamics, as energy is transferred or transformed, more and more of it is wasted. So my take on that is this. It takes a lot of sunlight to make a much smaller amount of grass, and then it takes a lot of grass to feed a much smaller amount of cow. So at each stage, a lot of energy is being lost. And so it just by definition, by physics, is a inefficient system. And if we look at sort of the whole food chain process, we've got the sun, the feed, the forage, the feed, the cow, the milk, the ice cream, and we're at each stage, energy is being lost, we're resulting in water pollution, and there are greenhouse gas emissions. So if we ate more of a plant-based diet, we wouldn't have this level of energy loss. We would still have this, but we wouldn't have this. And so this is one environmental reason why, as more people in parts of the world like China turn to eating larger amounts of meat that they couldn't afford before, and now that they're more affluent, they want it, we're going to see greater and greater emissions occurring. And one way to turn that around is to reduce our reliance on animal products. And I'm not saying everyone has to become a vegan, but we could certainly eat less, and that would be a way to have some impact. If you look at the impact of livestock on climate change, we see a different greenhouse gas emissions occurring at different stages of feed production, the processing, transport, and land use. And then in the animal production, particularly with cows, methane is a huge issue. The good thing and bad thing about methane, I told you it's a very potent greenhouse gas, so it's much more potent than carbon dioxide. And so it's a real problem. But it's also very short-lived compared to carbon dioxide. So it's called a short-lived climate pollutant. And the good thing about that is if we could reduce our emissions of methane, we would see change more quickly because we would actually see the methane in the atmosphere deteriorating more quickly than carbon dioxide does. I think methane takes roughly 10 years to degrade, whereas carbon dioxide takes about 120. So Dr. Gates talked about that long lag time, that even if we reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, it would be a long time before we would see, serious change. But with methane, we could start seeing the changes more quickly. So that's one reason it's important to really try to get a handle on methane as soon as possible. It's so strong and it breaks down quickly. So all of these fossil fuels that we need for our industrialized agriculture contribute to climate change. And what we're seeing, the impacts of climate change on agriculture, in some parts of the world, we're seeing a lot of flooding. I mean, in the United States, in the Midwest, farm fields are just being destroyed by flooding. And obviously, if they flood, their crops die, and not only do the farmers not make money, but we don't have as much food or other products. In other parts of the world, we have a serious drought problem, and that's going to get worse, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in the western United States. In parts of the world where we have agricultural production occurring close to coastlines, with rising sea level, we have saltwater intrusion. And if there's too much salt in the soil and the water, you can't grow crops. And then the other thing, as a former entomologist, this is something I'm very interested in, that with climate change, we're seeing the migration of pests to places where they didn't exist before. So pests that used to be considered tropical are migrating into temperate areas. I live in Florida. We're seeing that already. We're seeing actually mosquito-borne diseases like dengue fever that didn't used to exist in Florida. But the same with crop pests. So we're seeing more dramatic problems with pests in our crops, and this is only going to get worse with more climate change. And then, you have to think about, if you have crops that are stressed because of heat, stressed because of either too much or too little water, and then you have outbreaks of pests, they really aren't going to have the resilience or the resistance to be able to survive as well as if they weren't stressed in those ways. So, some of these impacts from climate change on agriculture that in the aggregate will be severe in many parts of the world that are already food insecure. So the heat can change the growing seasons. Certain crops do not grow well in heat. But beyond that, the heat can cause heat stress on livestock, and it can cause heat stress on farm workers. So there's concerns about that. We've talked a little bit about pests and disease. Another thing that's really interesting, there's so much research now on growing certain crops in a high carbon dioxide atmosphere actually changes the nutritional value of some of those crops. So some food crops, if they're grown in high carbon dioxide, they have reduced protein in the crops, reduced iron, reduced zinc, and other nutrients that we need in our diets. So besides sort of overall concerns with decreases in food production, the foods that we do produce may be less nutritious. And that is particularly a problem in parts of the world that are already food insecure, where people are already struggling to get enough nutritious food. All of these things can affect prices, and if food prices go up, people who are living on the margins aren't going to have access to food. I haven't really focused, my talk is really more about agriculture, but I need to point out the dramatic impacts that climate change is likely to have on fisheries. And a lot of people in the world rely on fisheries for their food. So we have the combination of oceans getting hotter, which I was just talking to someone earlier who was going to talk after me about the clam industry really having serious impacts from the heat waves in the ocean, but also ocean acidification from the increased carbon in the atmosphere. Then shellfish can't build their shells, coral reefs can't build their structures that a lot of fish populations rely on. So that's another piece of it. How am I doing on time? And as I've said, the people who are already the most vulnerable people in the world will suffer the most from these issues. So some of the numbers, and I have to point out that the changes in food production or yields from climate change will vary greatly around the world. There may be some places, particularly in temperate zones, where we actually have a slight increase in yield. But in many parts of the world where they're already very stressed, the yields are expected to go down as much as 40% in some areas like India. Prices increases could be, 25% higher, 50% higher. Worker safety issues and productivity of workers in high temperature, high humidity areas. I live in Florida. I know how hard it is to even just work in my garden in the heat, let alone to be a farm worker who has to work all day, every day in those conditions. Growing periods are expected to decline. Most agriculture in the world is rain-fed, about 70%, not irrigated. So if you don't have irrigation systems in place and there's droughts, you're not going to be able to grow crops. And the poorer areas of the world don't have the technological or economic resources to easily adapt to these changes. Okay, so I always feel like with these climate change discussions, it's like, all right, now it's all the gloom and doom, but what can we do? So have you all seen these carbon stabilization wedge graphs? So some researchers at Princeton years ago came up with this idea of looking, because there's not one simple solution to climate change. It's multifaceted. There's a lot of different things we have to do. And if you kind of look at, if this is our target to get down to this level of carbon dioxide, we're not going to do it just with electric efficiency. But if we do all these different things, electric efficiency, renewable, geologic disposal of carbon, vehicle efficiency, et cetera, you put all those wedges together and you get this climate stabilization triangle, which can get us to where we need to be. So we're going to have to do a lot of different things. The good news is that we can do those things. We just need to have the political will to do them. But one thing that is, I actually tried to find one of these that had agricultural changes as part of the solution, as part of the wedges, and I couldn't find one. And when I told you before that agriculture, depending on how you measure it, but it accounts for roughly 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, plus agriculture can be used to sequester carbon, why isn't it showing up in any serious way on these charts? We could include agriculture and make a significant contribution in that way. But how are we going to do it? When we talk about climate change, we talk about climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. Mitigation is avoiding the unmanageable. So we try to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions so that we don't end up with an unmanageable problem. Adaptation, on the other hand, is managing the unavoidable. We are already experiencing climate change. We're going to experience more. So how do we adapt to it? How do we manage these changed conditions? And the interesting thing about agriculture, remember I talked about that close link, is that we can find solutions in agriculture that are both mitigation and adaptation, that do both things at the same time. When we read about agricultural adaptation to climate change currently, a lot of the discussion is this very piecemeal kind of adaptation, like, well, we need new crop varieties that are more drought resistant, or more resistant to salinity, or more resistant to pests or disease, either through traditional plant breeding or through genetic modification of our crop plants. And that's certainly true. Those things can help. Or we say, well, we need to be more adaptive. We need to change our planting times. Farmers are already doing that. You know, we need to, in some places, start planting earlier, in other places start planting later, or have better pest control, those types of things. But these are piecemeal solutions that, according to the IPCC, have strong limits on how far they're going to be able to go for adaptation. So what we really need is a more transformative strategy, and I argue built on the foundation of ecological resilience. We hear this term resilience thrown around all the time now, but from the scientific standpoint, ecological resilience means something very specific, and it's capturing the strength of redundancies in the system so that we have reinforcing processes and compensated functions provided by more than one species, which allows the system to absorb disturbances like extreme climate events and to persist despite the disruption. So the way the metaphor that's often used to describe ecological resilience is, say there's an airplane wing and there's rivets holding the wing onto the plane. If you just had one rivet, if that rivet pops, the wing is off the plane, right? But by having the redundancies, by having a lot of rivets on the plane, you can pop off one, two, you know, maybe a certain number of them, and that can still maintain its integrity until you get to some point where it's just too many. And so by having diversity in the system, we can build resilience. Both like the potato famine example where we have different crop varieties, but also different species. We have the predators and parasites of the pests as part of the species, the pollinators as part of the species on the farm field. We mix animal and plant components, and we can build much more resilient systems that are more easily able to absorb these changes and respond to them, but also are not causing the same level of contribution because we're not as reliant on fossil fuels. And the interesting thing about a lot of this is it's not really new. It's how we used to farm. We need genetic diversity. We need a diversity of species, diversity in planting patterns. When we used to do intercropping, growing different crops together, you can have some crops that are actually fertilizing the soil, the nitrogen-fixing crops. You can have crops that provide the habitat for the predators and parasites of pest species. All of these things living together to make it a more robust system. Crop rotation is really important because in industrial agriculture, we don't really do that. We've turned it into sort of a sterile industrial environment, but with crop rotation, not only can you alternate crops with nitrogen-fixing crops so you don't need as much fertilizer or synthetic fertilizer, but if you keep planting the same crop over and over again, all the pests of that crop, it's like an all-you-can-eat buffet. They just live in the soil and they're just there waiting for you to plant again. Whereas if you rotate different crops, those pests will lose their food source for a season, and there won't be as many of them when you plant that, say if it was corn and the corn earworm problem. When you plant corn again, you won't have all those corn earworms just waiting for the new crop of corn. Refugia is where you leave some natural areas on the farm so that pollinators, predators, and parasites of pests can live and help to provide a certain level of natural control on the farm. Also birds and other vertebrate species as well. This is just a picture of intercropping, where you have two different crops. You rotate, or you alternate every row of a different crop. This is, there are a lot, this is does anybody know what this is? This looks kind of weird, like science fiction thing. This is a pest caterpillar, and these little things on it are a parasitic wasp egg, or cocoon actually. So these parasitic wasps, and that's why I keep talking about the importance of predators and parasites of pests. They can control populations of these pests. These wasps lay their eggs on the caterpillars, and the larvae actually grow in the caterpillar and kill it. So we have these natural pesticides available to us. But when we spray a lot of pesticides, we end up killing these natural components of the system. So how am I doing on time here? I guess I have a little bit. What's that? 9 minutes. Okay. Okay. So I'm a lawyer, right? So I'm supposed to be talking about law. Okay, let me get to the law part of this. How do we, from a legal policy standpoint, how do we achieve some of these changes that are necessary? And the thing that is interesting to me as an environmental lawyer is that most agricultural activities are exempt from most environmental laws. We don't treat agriculture the same way we treat other industry. And there may be good reason for that. We need food, right? We need agricultural products. And because unlike a factory where you have pollution coming out of a pipe going into a river, agriculture is dispersed. Farmers usually operate on very small profit margins. So, we've kind of given them a pass on a lot of these things. But because of that, we are not requiring the same kind of reductions in pollutants as we do with other industry. The Clean Water Act, for example, exempts most agricultural runoff from the requirements that apply to all other industries. If the Clean Water Act required of agriculture what it does of other industry, we could not use the massive amounts of synthetic fertilizer that we do, because we have huge amounts of fertilizer running off of ag fields, and which is causing most of the water quality problems in the United States today. Our pesticide laws do not do anything to incentivize the use of non-toxic forms of pest control. As long as, under our pesticide law, as long as under a cost-benefit balancing analysis, the overall benefits, the economic benefits outweigh the environmental or human health harms, the pesticide gets registered without any concern for, do we really need this pesticide? Or are there better, less toxic, or non-chemical controls available, so that we would rather encourage that those kinds of controls be used. So there's a lot we could do to revise our environmental laws to try to address the agricultural contributions in a more serious way. The other issue with our laws is really the agricultural policy side of things. We have, if anybody's ever tried to read the Farm Bill, all I can say is good luck. It is the most complicated, arcane, huge law that I can think of, and there are so many different programs in it. I obviously can't talk about all of them, but some of them that I think are particularly problematic is some of our commodity programs, which incentivize the production of certain crops in certain ways. So farmers can receive money that's tied to production levels of grain crops, even if the market doesn't demand those crops. And so we have, historically, we had overproduction of a lot of crops because of that. And that sort of led to this whole corn ethanol biofuel push, which has created a lot of problems in and of itself. A lot of forested and grasslands have been converted to produce corn ethanol biofuel, and it's resulting in land grabs in Africa and other parts of the world where people are trying to make money off of it. So I'll just give you an example of one type of commodity program. It's called a marketing assistance loan. So a farmer at the beginning of the season will put his or her crop up as collateral and receive money from the Commodity Credit Corporation, which is sort of a semi-government run program. And if the farmer then can't sell the crop for a certain price, they just don't repay the loan, and the government keeps the crop as collateral. So there's this incentive to produce and to produce in this industrialized, high fossil fuel input way, even if there's no market for the crop. So a lot of these programs made a lot of sense, you know, back in the 30s, back in the Depression and the Dust Bowl, but we really need to rethink them. And I'm not against subsidies for farmers, but I think the subsidies should be designed to promote more resilient, sustainable forms of agriculture as opposed to promote industrialized agriculture. Right now, a farmer who grows grains and gets these subsidies, if he puts vegetables and fruits on his farm, he could lose the subsidy. So it's like anti-diversity, the way these programs currently work. We also have these programs where we demand certain cosmetic standards of our foods, that they look a certain way. And we have these things called defect action levels, that if there's too many rusty spots on an orange, you can't sell it, even though it has nothing to do with health, human health, or the quality of the taste of the orange. And even though most of the oranges are used to produce orange juice, so nobody's even going to see the skin. So that encourages the use of certain pesticides that, you know, we really don't need. So we really need to rethink a lot of these programs, our ag policy programs, that are very outdated, that are provide very perverse economic incentives, and do not sort of have the opposite effect of promoting a sustainable, resilient agricultural system. The UN has come out, this is just an example of the amount of money that we spend on these commodity programs, which go to a very small percentage overall of farmers, and just for these grain crops tied to production levels instead of to a variety of kinds of food, where we could do more to promote environmentally friendly practices. So the UN has come out with climate smart best farming practices, and these are some of the things that I talked about a little bit earlier, trying to build a more resilient agricultural system. I think we can shift subsidies to encourage more resilient practices and away from the encouragement of the less resilient practices. And as I said, I think there are a number of ways that we can modify our existing environmental laws so that we address these concerns with the fossil fuel inputs and the pollution outputs of our industrialized agricultural system. So with that, I guess I'll just end with a quote from someone you all know. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Angelo. And now I'm introducing Professor Naja from the Business School. His surname is a long Indian name, and pronouncing it with a Scottish accent would confuse everyone. So Professor Naja is going to lead the conversation Q&A. And note that because of the class transition, people are leaving for class. That's just the rotation of the day. And we just accommodate that because we want as many students from different classes to come and join us. Okay, thanks all. And our two students are going to come forward to hold the microphones.
My job here is to speak very little and let you ask the questions. And whenever there is silence, I have my own thoughts on it.
Hey, first of all, I want to say thank you for your talk. It was great. I have a question about the viability of insect protein. I just want to know what your opinion is on that, especially in the West with our culture of kind of ooh, bugs, I don't know. But it could definitely reduce methane emissions a lot, and I was curious about what your opinion on that is.
So your insects have a lot of protein in their bodies, and they're, in terms of mass, there's a lot of biomass of insects on the planet. And so we're starting to hear, more of a discussion about relying on insect protein. There are many parts of the world that already rely on insect protein quite heavily. In the Western cultures, we find that disgusting, right? We get queasy when we think about eating insects. Back when I was an entomology graduate student, somebody gave me a book called Entertaining with Insects. It was like a cookbook of insect recipes, and everybody thought that was so funny. But it certainly, from a nutrition and environmental standpoint, there are a lot of benefits to it. We would have to get over our queasiness with it, and it's just so ingrained in our culture. But other cultures where people grow up eating insects, they think it's perfectly normal. So it's just really a cultural shift that would have to occur. But I think it certainly could be part of the solution to getting protein in ways that are more sustainable.
Thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I wonder what the practicality is of thinking we could change anything in the Farm Bill. The policies and practices ingrained there are really deep and well entrenched in the culture, especially of the Midwest. And I agree with you that it's been destructive to farming communities and even whole American value ideals, if you will. But reality, how in the world are we going to actually change the farm subsidy program?
It's a big challenge, but there have been some changes over the years. In the 2014, I think it was, Farm Bill, we got rid of the direct payments to farmers, the paying farmers who don't grow anything, which from an environmental standpoint isn't that big of a deal, but it from a sort of doesn't make any sense standpoint to sometimes, wealthy people who just happen to own historical farmland and they're not growing anything, we're getting money from the government. So we have gotten rid of that. And over the years, numerous environmental programs have been added to the Farm Bill that promote conservation of wetlands or conservation of highly erodible lands, that promote certain practices that are designed to reduce water pollution problems, that provide incentives to farmers who engage in these practices or put their land, some of their wetlands or whatever, in conservation easements. So we have seen gradual, incremental changes that are positive. I think you're right, it's going to be hard to make these big changes. But, you know, a lot of these changes we need are going to be hard, but we still have to try, is the way I see it.
Yeah, thank you. To follow up on that, I was curious about the role of urban agriculture, and I was curious, so two-part question, what do you think of that, either mixed-use small gardens or hydroponic agriculture in former factory buildings? And then do you have examples of local laws that could be changed to enhance that? So if we can't do something on a national level, do you have examples of cities that are changing their zoning or local laws that would improve things?
Yeah, so urban agriculture has become a big thing in the last 10 years, and you know, everybody has chickens in their backyard now, right? So there's pros and cons to that. I think that generally having people be able to grow their own food, or having communities being able to grow their own food, and having people connected to the way their food is grown is really beneficial. That, you know, people have it with their backyard garden, aren't engaged in these huge industrialized practices, and from a food security standpoint, kind of like the victory gardens in World War II, right, where people were encouraged to grow their own food and be part of the solution instead of having to rely on outside sources. I know that there are a lot of local governments throughout the country who have been revising ordinances to address these urban agricultural issues. So there's a lot of places, like I know Detroit has done a lot to try to encourage community farms and gardens and backyard chickens and that kind of thing, which has been part of the revitalization of Detroit. I know the community where I live, there have been changes to the ordinances to no longer ban certain practices, you know, so that people can have small agricultural activities in their communities instead of having everything just be sterile grass that doesn't provide any food or other products and but requires a lot of water and fertilizer. But, you know, people are concerned with roosters in their neighborhood and the wastes produced by animals in their neighborhood. So all of those things have to be addressed. So I was in Cuba a couple years ago, and it was fascinating because they have huge urban farms in Havana and neighborhood gardens and urban farms that are really very relied upon, and they're very proud of them. And so I think, you know, that's an interesting model. Cuban agriculture is fascinating because when the Soviet Union stopped providing them with heavy equipment and pesticides and fertilizers and fossil fuels, they really went to this agroecology form of agriculture that's primarily organic. And it's going to be interesting to see as the economy opens up there whether they can keep that and translate that into perhaps an export market, or whether they're going to go the way of industrialized agriculture. I kind of went off on a Cuba thing, but it reminded me of that because of the urban ag there.
Hi, I went to school in the Midwest too and saw the boon of ethanol production and farmers' great last hope of producing corn as a fuel. Here's a legal question that kind of dances around food sustainability, and that is that there were, years ago, other forms of crops that produced fuel like hemp, which has since been outlawed. How do you respond to that? That here's a sustainable crop that has way less crop damage, that grows maybe twice a year, and it's outlawed.
Well, the most recent, the 2018 Farm Bill actually had programs incentivizing production of hemp, not the the kind with the THC in it, but the hemp. And I mean, look at, not that this is a fuel, but just look at the Boone and CBD oil sales, right? So people are using a lot of hemp products now. And then, of course, in many states, marijuana is legalized, even though it's not on a federal level. There are a lot of cellulosic biofuels that could potentially be much more beneficial than corn ethanol. It takes a lot of energy to make corn energy, so it's like it's not necessary. There's different studies, but it's probably not really a net benefit if you look at everything that goes into producing it and what you get out of it. You're putting all these fossil fuels in and getting about the same amount of energy out. And there are other types of plants, you know, that would be much more efficient. I don't know how much of the problem is the technology isn't there for some of them, but also we have in the Farm Bill, at one point I knew the number, I don't know the exact number now, of how many incentive programs there were for corn ethanol. There are a lot of incentives for corn ethanol in the Farm Bill, in addition to the general incentives for corn, which most, if you don't know this, most of the corn grown in the United States is either used for biofuel or animal feed. We don't eat it, or it's used in processed foods. So I think that we could do a lot better with biofuels by switching those incentives from corn ethanol to the cellulosic biofuel production. That's much more sustainable and more efficient.
Hi, thank you. Would you please be willing to speak a little bit on genetically modified seed and its role in food security or food insecurity? Because on the one hand, it's developed to give crazy high yields and resilience to pest and even salt water. And on the other, it's also developed to be obsolete so that it stops reproducing after 1 or 2 generations.
So in the early 90s, when I was at the Environmental Protection Agency, one of my big projects was working on developing EPA's rules on genetically modified crops. It was a new technology. We were just trying to figure out what do we do with this. And what's interesting is at the time, it was being promoted as we can feed starving people in Africa. We can develop these crops that are like cassava that's resistant to the cassava mosaic virus, and cassava is a staple food in a lot of parts of the world. You know, we can really help people. But what happened is patent law. So when the courts started allowing genetic material, including naturally occurring genetic material, to be patented, and then you see these big companies like Monsanto buying up all the patents, whether they were going to use them or not, and then bringing patent infringement suits against small farmers who either were using their seeds either inadvertently or intentionally. It sort of stifled the development of genetic modified crops that can actually help people in places where they don't have enough food, because now it's all about, you know, making money. And so I'm not, you know, I think that genetically modified organisms, they're not all the same thing. You can take a gene from one variety of corn and put it into another variety of corn, and the risks are probably pretty low. But you can also take, you know, the gene that produces spider venom out of a spider and put it in a strawberry plant, and then you have bigger issues. So I think that you can't paint it all with a broad brush. You have to look at exactly what it is. I think that it has failed to address a lot of the food security problems that it could have. It's being touted as something that can address climate change impacts to food security. I think it could be part of the solution. I don't think it's a huge part of the solution. But, you know, we've seen a lot of problems with GMOs because the ones that have been in the greatest widespread use are the plants that have been modified to make them resistant to pests, and they've outcrossed with some weedy relatives, and now you have weeds that are resistant to pests. They've also, because in a genetically modified plant that produces a pesticidal substance like the Bacillus thuringiensis toxin that's normally produced by bacteria that's been used in agriculture for decades, but now you have thousands of acres of crops with every cell in the plant producing that substance all the time, and it's accelerated the resistance to that useful low-risk pesticide. And so we're seeing pests that are really developing resistance to these tools that we've had, you know. I don't know if I answered your question, but
Let me ask a follow-up question.
yeah.
So you said that GMOs were promoted partially to address food security issues, that they could increase yield per acre. But we also now know that food waste is a lucrative industry.
Yes.
That I read an article that it's a $2 trillion opportunity. I'm selling T, not a B or M. It's a $2 trillion opportunity. So if we have so much waste, do we then need a GMO to address production issue? And if it is a production issue, then why are people going hungry? So is it an access issue?
Yes, there's definitely an access issue. You know, we've had times in our history where people in certain parts of the world were dealing with extreme hunger while the United States was literally dumping food into the ocean because we had an excess. So production is just one piece of it. And, you know, we also, our farm policies, over the years, we've paid people not to grow things while other people in the world were starving. Access is a huge issue. And we have, through our policies, we've also made some people more dependent on importing food than growing their own food, and which is a part of the access problem. If people had more independence, you know, and more ability to grow their own food. So yeah, I mean, it's not just we need to produce more, we need to produce more. That's just one piece of it. The food needs to get to where it's needed. And there's all kinds of economic and political reasons why it doesn't always get there.
John.
Getting back to Monsanto, how is a corporation like that able to skirt antitrust laws? Because it just seems to me when you look at, you have every aspect that goes into industrialization, from the seed itself to the fertilizer to the Roundup, you know, poison itself, or you have someone like ConAgra that seems to, you know, and most recently I understand that most of the tariff money that went to bail out the farmers also went to the large agro industry as opposed to the little farmers themselves. How do they stay resistant to that?
So you're right that there's a few large agribusiness companies that really control the world food market. And one thing is there's vertical integration so that they sell the seeds, they make the genetically modified seeds that are resistant to the Roundup, and then they sell the Roundup, and they, you know, and it just goes all the way up the chain. But also, and I'm not an antitrust law expert, but agriculture generally is exempt from antitrust law.
How do we change that?
I think, well, I mean, part of it is vote for people who have policies more in line with what you believe in. Yeah, it's a big problem because they have so much power. Just a handful of companies have a huge amount of power. I was at EPA back in the early 90s when Monsanto was coming in and telling us how their Roundup Ready soy was going to reduce the amount of herbicides that were used. And it didn't make any sense intuitively, but they had this whole explanation about it. And of course, the total opposite has happened, and we have dramatically increased the amount of glyphosate Roundup that's used in this country. It's used on a massive scale, and now we're starting to see these lawsuits about people who have gotten allegedly gotten lymphoma from using glyphosate. You know, it was supposed to be this totally safe herbicide, and anyway, these genetically modified plants it was going to enable the farmers to apply the herbicide earlier in the growing season, which meant they would apply less. I don't remember exactly how they explained it, but it didn't work out that way at all.
That's a question.
Thank you for the excellent talk. I got a lot of ideas out of it. I have one question, and it may be overly simple. If you had maybe 3 suggestions for the students and the rest of the audience as what actions we may take, do you have anything that we could maybe go forth from and maybe see if we can make a difference?
On a personal level, changes to your lifestyle, or
I say a little beyond a personal level to the lifestyle, but from the standpoint of trying to make change in our societal type changes. Bear in mind, we're talking, it's not just an individual student, but maybe as groups of students or groups of, whether it be members of a faith community or whatever. It may be a difficult thing to come up with.
Yeah, I
2,
mean,
3, 4, whatever.
I think that we need some serious change in the political level so that we have laws and policies that move us in the right direction. And we can do a certain amount as individuals in changing our carbon footprint, but without, big policy changes, it's not going to be enough. And I guess, when I think about what's happening now with young people, really angry about climate change and the risks it presents to their futures, I think that it's good to see that kind of speaking out about the problem, and hopefully that will be part of pressuring the political system to do something real to address the problem, because we are running out of time. We need to make some serious changes fairly soon. Scientists say, we're going to have we already see it, and we're going to have more, but to avoid big catastrophe, we might only have 10 years or so to make serious changes, and the only way those big changes are going to happen is going to be on a big, our leaders making those changes happen, and it's not happening here now. The opposite is happening here now.
Hey, me again. What do you think about the applicability of food forests, or the permaculture idea that you can grow food in our everyday environments to combat food access issues?
Yeah, I think it's another, you're raising good parts of the solution. Certainly that is an important aspect of it. There's places doing interesting things with growing fruit trees on public lands, or like the land surrounding a government building or whatever, and just having that food available to people who want it. And on a larger scale, larger permaculture activities. But I think there's a lot of great ideas out there that are part of the solution. It's just sort of like, how do we make them happen on a large enough scale it up to where it's really going to make a big difference. But I think there has been a lot of movement in the last 10 or 15 years to addressing the problem with inner city food deserts and ways to, try to get better access to nutritious foods in areas that historically were deserts, where people couldn't, there was no grocery store. And, you know, they might have to take a 2-hour bus ride to get to a store that actually sold fruits and vegetables. So, you know, with community farms and farmers markets and in cities and some of these other ideas have been incrementally changing that.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So I know that you didn't mean it that way, but you mentioned the word scale. So Mary Jane mentioned the word scale, even though she didn't mean it the same way as industrialized scale. So isn't the problem of our current system the desire to have scale to lower the costs? So shouldn't we then promote solutions that have always been there, that is, we eat what we can grow in our environment? That even though transportation may account for only 11%, much of the production costs are because of, much of the production emissions are because of the way we have grown food. Evidence suggests that organic plots are actually more productive from a resource intensity than industrialized or fertilizer-fed traditional crop. But we didn't talk about changing the entire system to organic, which is easier to do, because I've talked to farmers who say, if you like what we grow and if you appreciate what we do, then we will grow what you want to buy. Right? But if you don't want to pay for something unless it is sold by Whole Foods. See, Whole Foods can sell you ugly tomatoes for $4 and we will buy it, right? So the point is, how do we change the system whose goals are to increase consistency, convenience, and reduce costs?
So we have gotten in this country, very used to cheap food. If you look at the percentage of our income that we spent on food decades ago compared to now, we spend hardly anything on food. And part of the reason for that, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is the subsidy programs that are subsidizing mass production of certain kinds of mostly grain crops. And then a lot of that is used in processed foods. Another part of that is, I just blanked on what I was going to say. What was I going to say? Anyway, we've gotten used to really cheap foods, and I know what I was going to say. That our food prices don't reflect the negative externalities of our agriculture. If we really had a market-based approach to our food, and if it reflected the negative externalities of pollution and other problems with agriculture, we would have much more expensive food. Now, I'm not advocating that we should have much more expensive food, but I am advocating that if we're going to subsidize food production, let's subsidize the production that's done in a sustainable way and subsidize the production of healthier foods, both to benefit farmers who do, farming is a hard business with low profit margins and a lot of risk, and I understand that. So I benefit the farmers and the consumers, but I think we're subsidizing the wrong things right now. It might have made sense a long time ago, but it doesn't make sense anymore.
Probably as the only person who fed a farm before they came here this morning, I think you need to make a distinction between the family farmer and big ag. Pennsylvania big ag is very influential, but the family farms really don't profit from these subsidies.
Right.
And they're hardworking. It's big ag that's profiting. Now, I would say before we can solve these issues, we need to eliminate the agricultural exemptions. For example, they're exempt from child labor laws. You can have a 12-year-old child driving a John Deere tractor, no problem, right? They're exempt from the rabies requirements. We don't have to vaccinate our animals for rabies. I do, but we don't have to do that. So we have all these exemptions, which if they were eliminated, and one of the big problems we have, mine's a sanctuary farm for rescued animals, and by the way, we have no pest problem because the bats eat the mosquitoes, the possum and the ducks and the geese eat the ticks, so we don't have that problem. But one of the big problems in exemption for big ag is they're exempt from our animal cruelty laws. And if they had to follow those, we could close down the factory farms like Europe is passing laws to do. So what I'm asking you is, don't you think a big step would be to eliminate the agricultural exemptions and close the factory farms?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I'm appalled at the way animals are treated in factory farms, which is part of the reason I haven't eaten meat in a very long time, although I do still eat some dairy. But ag, and I was focused on the environmental part because ag is exempt from a lot of regulations. So the Clean Water Act and, you know, some of the Clean Air Act and some of the other laws exempt a lot of ag activities, antitrust laws, animal cruelty. I mean, yeah, there are a lot of exemptions, and I think, and I definitely see the distinction between the family farmer and big industrialized ag, and so I'm mostly talking about the big industrialized ag. Family farmers who want to, you know, like I had a slide, I don't remember the exact number, but the vast majority of these commodity subsidies are going to these huge producers. It's not going to the family farmer. It's not going to the organic farmer or the family farmer who's trying to do things in a sustainable, healthy way. And so that's why I think, you know, there's an area where we could really make some changes for the better.
I get the signal that it's 30 minutes, so if Jerry would allow, I think we have time for one more question.
Sure. I was wondering, you talked a lot about the problems on a global scale and then the U.S. policy solutions. So one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is climate migration, and specifically how U.S. actions influence environmental and economic pressure on folks who live in Latin America, Central America, and are migrating north. So I'm curious to know if you have ideas about what the U.S.'s role could be in a response to that.
In response to the migration, or?
In a response to just climate migration in general, or the fact that our emissions are leading to an acceleration in the need for evacuation?
So the people, well, on a per capita basis, the United States has the highest greenhouse gas emissions by far. And several years ago, China exceeded our overall emissions, but not on a per capita basis. It's just they have a lot more people. And also, we've exported a lot of our carbon footprint to China because they manufacture so many of our goods. So I guess my point is the people who are contributing the most are not the people who are going to suffer the most. The people who are going to suffer the most aren't contributing much to the problem. Climate migration is going to be huge because not only are you going to have a lot of our population is in coastal areas. At some point, those areas are going to become uninhabitable. But also, you know, areas with severe drought or severe flooding, more conflict in certain areas, less water available in certain areas. There's going to be a lot of migration, and I think, you know, I don't think the world is prepared for the level of migration that we could see if we don't do something soon. I think that, you know, I haven't given up on trying to mitigate our contributions to climate change because I think some of the adaptation will be very challenging. I don't know how you adapt to millions of people being displaced all over the world. I mean, maybe hundreds of millions of people. That's going to be a huge humanitarian crisis.
Thank you, Professor Angelo. This has been a wonderful presentation and conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have 30 minutes break before we go to our next presentation, and I encourage you to visit our posters over on this side, and we have refreshments and some little munchies on the outside in the Shepperson Suite. So have a break, and we'll see you in about 25 minutes. Thank you.